Summer 1944, Camp Hereford, Texas. The thermometer hit 105 degrees by noon, and the dust from the high plains turned everything the color of rust. Inside the barbed wire perimeter, 3,000 Italian prisoners of war tried to find shade that didn't exist. They'd surrendered in North Africa 18 months earlier. Shipped across the Atlantic in the cargo holds of Liberty ships and deposited in the middle of nowhere. Most had never seen anything like West Texas. The landscape stretched flat and endless in every direction, broken only by mesquite and the occasional windmill. At night the stars looked close enough to touch. During the day the sun felt close enough to kill. These men, farmers from Sicily, mechanics from Milan, students from Rome, found themselves 6,000 miles from home with nothing but time. That's when somebody kicked a ball. Nobody remembers who started it. Probably one of the younger prisoners, bored out of his mind, fashioned something round from scrap cloth and twine. Within days, makeshift goals appeared at opposite ends of the compound. Teams formed along regional lines. Sicilians versus Tuscans. Northerners versus Southerners. The games were chaotic, passionate, often ending in shouting matches about disputed calls, but they played. Every afternoon when work details finished, they played. The guards watched from the towers, bemused. Back home, Americans played baseball. This foreign game with the round ball and the no-hands rule looked strange to them. But the prisoners played like their lives depended on it, and maybe in a way they did. Because when you're far from home and uncertain if you'll ever return, you cling to whatever reminds you of who you are. By August, the games had structure. Someone found actual soccer balls in a shipment of Red Cross supplies. The camp commander, a pragmatic lieutenant colonel named Morrison, noticed the prisoners seemed calmer on days they played. Fewer fights. Better cooperation on work assignments. He made a calculation that would change everything. He ordered the construction of a proper field. The prisoners couldn't believe it. They were enemies, technically. Captives. Yet here were American soldiers helping them level ground. Install real goalposts, mark boundary lines with lime. Within 2 weeks, Camp Hereford had a regulation-sized soccer pitch that would have been the envy of towns back in Italy. The prisoners named it Campo dell'Esperanza, Field of Hope. Word spread through the camp like electricity. Men who hadn't touched a ball in years suddenly remembered they'd played for their village team. A former semi-professional from Genoa took charge of organizing proper matches. They created a league with 8 teams, each representing different regions of Italy. Jerseys were improvised from dyed undershirts. Someone with artistic talent painted team crests on scraps of wood. The first official match happened on a Saturday morning in September. By 9 a.m., nearly every prisoner in the camp had gathered around the field. The guards looked nervous. This many men assembled in one place could mean trouble. But as the referee's whistle blew and the game began, something else happened entirely. The prisoners cheered. They sang. They chanted the names of players and regions. For 90 minutes, the war disappeared. The barbed wire disappeared. They weren't prisoners anymore. They were Italians watching their teams play the beautiful game under a brutal Texas sky. When the final whistle blew, both teams shook hands. The crowd dispersed peacefully. The guards relaxed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison watched from his office window. He'd fought in North Africa, seen these same men as enemies less than 2 years ago. Now he watched them celebrate a goal like kids in a schoolyard. War did strange things to people. Peace did stranger things. He picked up his phone and called the mayor of Hereford. The town of Hereford, Texas, population 3,800, sat 3 miles from the POW camp. Most residents knew the Italians were there, but thought little about it. The prisoners worked on local farms sometimes, always under guard. They seemed quiet, polite, not at all like the enemy they'd imagined. But they were still the enemy. You didn't forget that. When Mayor Henderson received Morrison's call, his first instinct was to refuse. The lieutenant colonel was proposing something unprecedented. Let the Italian prisoners play a soccer match against the local high school team. In public, with townspeople watching. The idea seemed insane, but Morrison made his case carefully. The prisoners had been model captives. The soccer league kept them occupied and peaceful. The high school boys had heard about the games and were curious about this European sport. It would be educational. Cultural exchange. Besides, what harm could come from a soccer game? Henderson talked it over with the school board that evening. The debate lasted 2 hours. Some board members thought it was dangerous. Others called it unpatriotic. But the school's coach, a young man named Dutch Hübner who'd been classified 4F due to a bum knee, spoke up. His boys needed something to rally around. The football season hadn't started yet. A challenge match against foreigners. That sounded like an adventure. The board voted 5-4 in favor. The match would happen in 2 weeks, on a Saturday afternoon at the high school field. Admission would be free. American flags would fly. The national anthem would play before kickoff. And if anything went wrong, armed guards would be present to restore order immediately. News of the match spread through Hereford like a brush fire. Some families said they'd boycott. Their sons were fighting overseas. They wouldn't watch enemy soldiers play games. Others were curious. They'd never seen soccer before. Some wanted to prove American boys could beat the Italians at their own sport. The town split down the middle between those who thought it was a terrible idea and those who just wanted to see what would happen. The prisoners selected their best players for the match. The semi-professional from Genoa would captain the team. They chose men from different regions to represent all of Italy. Someone sewed a proper Italian flag, which they planned to display alongside the American one. They practiced every day that final week, running drills with an intensity that surprised even themselves. This wasn't just a soccer match anymore. This was about pride. About showing these Americans that Italy, despite losing the war, still had dignity, still had culture, still had the beautiful game. They'd been defeated as soldiers, but they could win as footballers. The distinction mattered to them in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. The American high school team prepared too, though with less certainty. Most had never played soccer. Coach Hübner taught them the basic rules. No hands except the goalkeeper. Offsides, throw-ins. They practiced for a week but looked clumsy and confused. The boys kept wanting to pick up the ball. Their instincts were all wrong for this sport. But they had youth and energy and home field advantage. Plus, they told themselves, these were prisoners. Defeated men. Surely that had to count for something. On Friday night before the match, the team gathered at Dutch Hübner's house. His wife made lemonade. The boys sat on the porch, nervous and excited, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Saturday arrived clear and hot, by 2 p.m., an hour before kickoff. The high school field began filling with spectators. The bleachers seated 500. Within 30 minutes they were full. People brought blankets and sat on the grass. By 2030, more than 200 people had gathered, a third of Hereford's entire population. The prisoners arrived in 2 transport trucks, accompanied by a dozen armed guards. They climbed down wearing their improvised jerseys, white undershirts with blue trim, the colors of Italy. When they jogged onto the field to warm up, the crowd went silent. These were the first enemy soldiers most townspeople had seen up close. They looked young. Some were boys, really 18 or 19. They moved with the fluid grace of natural athletes, passing the ball in intricate patterns, laughing and calling to each other in Italian. An old woman in the stands turned to her husband. "They don't look like monsters," she said quietly. He nodded but said nothing. The American team emerged from the school building to cheers and applause. They looked stiff and uncertain, their movements awkward, as they tried to copy the Italians' warm-up routines. The contrast was obvious to everyone. The prisoners were footballers. The Americans were kids learning a foreign game. At 3 p.m. sharp, both teams lined up for the national anthem. The band played "The Star, Spangled Banner." Every American stood with hand over heart. The Italian prisoners stood at attention, heads bowed respectfully. When the anthem ended, the referee, a local teacher who'd read a book about soccer rules, called the captains to midfield for the coin toss. Italy won the toss and elected to receive. The teams took their positions. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Then the referee blew his whistle, and the match began. For the first 5 minutes, the Americans held their own through sheer aggression and energy. They chased the ball everywhere, trying to win through effort what they lacked in skill. But the Italians were patient. They passed crisply, moved without the ball, created space where none seemed to exist. In the 8th minute, they scored. A beautiful goal. 3 quick passes split the American defense, and the semi-professional from Genoa slotted the ball, past the goalkeeper with casual precision. The Italian players celebrated with restrained joy, mindful they were still prisoners on enemy soil. But in the stands, something unexpected happened. A section of the crowd applauded. Not everyone, maybe 50 people. But they clapped for the skill and beauty of the goal, for the pure athleticism on display. Others in the crowd turned to stare at them, scandalized. How could they cheer for the enemy? But those who applauded shrugged. "That was a damn fine goal," one farmer said. "I can appreciate that." The Americans tried to respond but looked lost. Soccer's rhythms eluded them. They bunched around the ball like kids in a schoolyard game, leaving huge spaces for the Italians to exploit. By halftime, the score was 4-0. The American boys walked to the sideline dejected. They were being embarrassed in front of their own town. Coach Webner gathered them in a circle. He told them the score didn't matter. They were learning a new sport against experts. The important thing was to play hard and show character. The boys nodded, but their faces showed they wanted desperately to score. Just one goal, to salvage some pride from this disaster. The second half began with renewed American energy. They pressed higher, tackled harder, threw their bodies into every challenge. The Italians fell back slightly, content to protect their lead. The game grew scrappier, more physical. Then, in the 63rd minute, something shifted. An American forward named Billy Crawford received the ball 30 yards from goal. He'd played baseball his whole life and had a pitcher's aggressive confidence. Without thinking too hard, he struck the ball as hard as he could. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't technically perfect. but it flew like a rifle shot, rising and dipping, and nestled into the top corner of the Italian goal. The crowd erupted. Billy's teammates mobbed him. Even some spectators who'd been cheering for the Italians found themselves on their feet, caught up in the underdog moment. The score was 4-1. The Americans had salvaged something, but what happened next nobody expected. The Italian goalkeeper retrieved the ball and jogged to midfield. Instead of looking angry or disappointed, he was smiling. He stopped near Billy Crawford, extended his hand, and in broken English said, "Beautiful goal. Very strong." Billy, surprised, shook his hand. The crowd noise softened, as if everyone collectively held their breath. The match continued. Italy scored again in the 70th minute, then once more near the end. Final score 6-1. A thorough victory. But when the final whistle blew, both teams gathered at midfield. The Italians applauded the Americans' effort. The Americans applauded back, recognizing the superior skill they'd witnessed. Then the crowd did something that would be talked about in Hereford for generations. They stood and applauded too. For both teams. For the beautiful game they'd just discovered. For the strange experience of watching enemies compete with honor and respect. The applause lasted nearly a minute. After the match, some townspeople approached the Italian players. They asked questions about soccer, about Italy, about their lives before the war. The guards stayed alert but didn't interfere. Conversations happened in broken English and gestures. Someone brought out lemonade for both teams. The afternoon sun slanted low across the field, and for a little while, the war seemed very far away. Mayor Henderson watched all this from behind the bleachers. He'd been prepared for trouble, even violence. Instead, he'd witnessed something he couldn't quite name. Not friendship exactly. Too soon for that. But a recognition of shared humanity through sport. These Italian boys had stopped being the enemy the moment they'd played beautifully. And his American boys had earned respect by refusing to quit. The next day in church, the sermon focused on loving your enemies. The pastor didn't mention the soccer match directly, but everyone knew what he was talking about. Some parishioners bristled. Others nodded thoughtfully. The match had cracked something open in the town's collective consciousness. And like all cracks, nobody knew what would grow through it. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison received a call from the War Department on Monday. Someone had reported the soccer match. Was it true he'd allowed enemy prisoners to compete publicly against Americans? Morrison confirmed it. He expected a reprimand. Instead, the officer on the phone asked how it had gone. Morrison described the peaceful afternoon, the mutual respect, the positive response from the town. There was a pause on the line. Then, do it again. The War Department, it turned out, was interested in experiments that reduced tension around POW camps. The soccer match qualified. Morrison was authorized to schedule more matches, even to create a regular series. The brass in Washington wanted to see if sport could humanize the enemy and ease reintegration after the war. Morrison hung up the phone and smiled. He called Mayor Henderson. Would the town be interested in hosting a monthly match? Henderson said he'd ask around, but he already knew the answer. The first match had drawn 200 spectators. The next one would draw more by October. The monthly soccer matches between Camp Hereford's Italian POW team and various local opponents had become the town's biggest social event. The high school team, humbled but intrigued, kept practicing. They played the Italians twice more that fall, losing both times but narrowing the margins. Coach Hebner noticed his boys were learning. Their passing improved. They understood positioning better. Soccer was teaching them things football never had about teamwork and spatial awareness. Other towns heard about Hereford's experiment and grew curious. In November, a team from Amarillo drove 90 miles to challenge the Italian prisoners. That match drew 2,000 spectators. The parking situation became chaotic. Local businesses stayed open late to serve the crowds. The economic impact was undeniable. The PW Soccer League was bringing money into Hereford. But economics wasn't what kept people coming back. It was the games themselves. Soccer, it turned out, was endlessly fascinating once you understood it. The continuous play, the strategy, the moments of individual brilliance. The way a single pass could unlock an entire defense. Baseball had its charms, but soccer had a different kind of beauty. Americans were discovering what the rest of the world already knew. The Italian prisoners, meanwhile, found purpose in these matches. They weren't just passing time anymore. They were ambassadors for their country, for their culture, for the sport they loved. They took their role seriously. They practiced harder. They studied their opponents. They wanted to demonstrate that Italy, whatever its wartime failures, still possessed beauty and skill and passion. Some prisoners became local celebrities. The semi-professional from Genoa, whose name was Marco, gave soccer clinics to local kids on weekends. Parents brought their sons to learn from him. At first they came out of curiosity, but they kept coming because Marco was a natural teacher. He was patient and encouraging, and he made the game look like art. One Saturday, a father approached Marco after a clinic. His son loved the sessions, but the father struggled with the cognitive dissonance. How was he supposed to hate Italians when this particular Italian was teaching his boy to play soccer with such kindness? Marco didn't have an answer. He just kept teaching, kept smiling, kept demonstrating that individuals were more complex than any war could capture. December brought cold weather, but the matches continued. Someone donated old coats so the Italian players wouldn't freeze. The gesture was small but meaningful. These were enemy soldiers being given warm clothing by the civilians whose country they'd fought against. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone. War made enemies. Peace made neighbors. Soccer seemed to accelerate the transition. By Christmas 1944, Camp Hereford's Italian POWs soccer team had played 12 matches against various American opponents. Their record was 11-1. The single loss came against a team of former college players from Lubbock, who'd been discharged due to injuries. Even in defeat, the Italians played beautifully, and the crowd of 3,000, the biggest yet, showed appreciation for both teams. That Christmas, some Hereford families did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. They invited Italian prisoners to their homes for dinner. The invitations required special permission, which Lieutenant Colonel Morrison granted on a case-by-case basis. 12 prisoners spent Christmas Day in American homes, eating turkey and trying to communicate through language barriers and shared laughter. Marco spent Christmas with the family of Billy Crawford, the American forward who'd scored the beautiful goal in the first match. Billy's mother cooked a feast. His father asked Marco about Italy, about his family back home, about his life before the war. Marco answered as best he could in halting English. By the end of the evening, Billy's father said something that surprised everyone, including himself. "When this war ends, you come back and visit us properly." Marco nodded. not sure if the invitation was serious, but moved by the gesture, regardless. He'd come to America as a prisoner expecting nothing but confinement and hostility. Instead, he'd found soccer and respect, and now something that felt dangerously close to friendship. The war had taken so much from him. This strange Texas town had given something back. January 1945 brought news from Europe. The Allies were advancing. Germany was collapsing. Italy had already switched sides, declared war on Germany, and was fighting alongside the Allies. This complicated things for the prisoners at Camp Hereford. They were no longer enemy combatants, technically. They were co-belligerents. Some might even be called allies. The distinction mattered legally, but changed little practically. The prisoners remained imprisoned. Their status was unclear. Would they be sent home? Kept in America? Put to work elsewhere? Nobody knew. The uncertainty hung over the camp like fog. But the soccer matches continued. They were the one constant in a world that kept shifting. In February, the POW team played their most ambitious match yet. A team of Army officers stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso had heard about the Italian prisoners who played beautiful soccer. They fancied themselves decent players and wanted a challenge. The match was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in Hereford, and over 4,000 people showed up. The game was magnificent. Both teams played sophisticated, attacking soccer. The ball moved at lightning speed. The crowd watched in awe as these two groups of men, one American officers, one Italian prisoners, competed with fierce intensity but obvious mutual respect. The final score was 3-3, and when the whistle blew, both teams received standing ovations. After the match, the American officers invited the Italian players to join them for a meal. The prisoners looked at their guards uncertainly. Permission was granted. For 2 hours, officers and POWs ate together, swapped stories about the game, and talked about soccer they'd seen in Europe. The fact that some of these men had probably shot at each other a year or two earlier went unmentioned. The only thing that mattered now was the shared love of the game. March brought spring and hope. Germany was clearly finished. The war in Europe would end soon. Camp Hereford began preparing for what came next. Some prisoners would be repatriated to Italy. Others might stay in America if they chose. The government was considering options. But everyone knew the POW camp wouldn't last much longer. The soccer league took on a bittersweet quality. These might be the last matches. The Italians played with extra passion, as if trying to imprint their love of the game. American soil before they left. The crowds grew larger. People came from hundreds of miles away to see these legendary matches between Italian POWs and local teams. In April, news of Roosevelt's death reached the camp. The prisoners held a moment of silence before their next match. They'd been enemy soldiers under his command, but they recognized he'd been a great leader. More importantly, they recognized that Americans were grieving, and grief transcended enmity. The match that followed was perhaps the most emotional of the entire series. Both teams played with a solemnity and beauty that felt like a eulogy performed through sport. When it ended, a 2-1 Italian victory, players from both sides embraced at midfield. Some were crying. The crowd was silent except for scattered sniffles. Soccer had become something more than a game. It had become a language for expressing what words couldn't capture. May brought Germany's surrender. V-Day. The war in Europe was over. At Camp Hereford, the Italian prisoners didn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. They'd fought for the wrong side. Their country had been devastated. But at least the killing had stopped. That night, they sang songs around the soccer field under a huge Texas sky. Some songs were joyful. Some were sad. All were beautiful. The final match of the camp, Hereford POWs Soccer League, happened in June 1945. By then, everyone knew the camp would close within weeks. The prisoners would be processed for repatriation. Some would return to Italy to find homes destroyed and families scattered. Others would choose to stay in America, invited by farmers who'd employed them and grown to trust them. For the final match, the Italians played against a combined all-star team of the best American players they'd faced over the past year. Billy Crawford was there. The Army officers from Fort Bliss. High school kids who'd grown into decent players through practice and determination. The Italian team fielded their strongest lineup. This would be their farewell. Over 5,000 people attended. The bleachers overflowed. Families brought picnics and sat on the grass. Local businesses closed early so everyone could attend. The mayor threw out the ceremonial first ball, a tradition borrowed from baseball but adapted for soccer. When both teams took the field, the entire crowd rose to their feet and applauded for 3 full minutes. The match was played at the highest level the camp had ever seen. Both teams attacked with abandon. The score seesawed back and forth. With 5 minutes remaining, the game was tied 4-4. Then Marco, the semi-professional from Genoa, received the ball 30 yards from goal. He looked up, saw the goalkeeper slightly off his line, and struck a perfect chip shot that arced over the keeper's head and dropped just under the crossbar. The crowd exploded. Even Americans cheered for the sheer audacity and skill of the goal. Marco raised his arms, not in celebration but in acknowledgement. This was his goodbye to Texas, to America, to the strange and beautiful experience of finding humanity through sport in the middle of a prisoner of war camp. The Americans had one last chance. In the final minute, Billy Crawford found himself with the ball in space. He remembered Marco's goal from that first match, the one that had started everything. He struck the ball with everything he had. It flew toward the Italian goal, rising and dipping. The goalkeeper dove, but couldn't reach it. The ball hit the post with a metallic clang and bounced away. The final whistle blew. Italy won 5-4. But nobody really cared about the score. As both teams gathered at midfield, something spontaneous happened. The crowd surged onto the field. Not angrily or chaotically, but joyfully. Americans and Italians mixed together, shaking hands, hugging, exchanging addresses. Marco found himself surrounded by Hereford families who wanted to say goodbye. Billy Crawford's father pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. His address, a repeated invitation to visit after the war. Others did the same. By the time Marco returned to the transport truck, he had 17 addresses in his pocket from American families who wanted him to return someday as a free man, as a friend. The drive back to camp was quiet. The prisoners looked out at the West Texas landscape they'd grown to know. Flat and harsh and beautiful in its own way. They'd arrived as defeated enemies. They were leaving as something else. Not quite friends. Not quite allies, but human beings who'd connected with other human beings through the universal language of sport. Camp Hereford closed in August 1945. The prisoners were processed and sent home over the following months. The soccer field remained for a while, slowly deteriorating. Eventually it was plowed under and returned to agricultural use. The goalposts were salvaged for scrap metal. Within a few years, Little physical evidence remained of the camp or the extraordinary soccer league that had existed there. But the impact lingered. Hereford's high school adopted soccer as an official sport in 1946. Coach Dutch Huebner, who'd learned the game alongside his players, became one of Texas's first certified soccer coaches. He taught the sport for 30 years, always emphasizing the lessons he'd learned from watching Italian prisoners play with skill and grace under impossible circumstances. Billy Crawford enlisted in the Army after high school and was stationed in Italy in the late 1940s as part of the post-war occupation. He looked up Marco in Genoa. They spent a weekend together, watching local soccer matches and catching up through a translator. Marco had returned to a destroyed country and a scattered family, but he'd rebuilt. He was teaching soccer to kids in his neighborhood, passing on the love of the game just as he had in Texas. Before Billy left, Marco walked him to the train station. He thanked the young American for helping him survive the hardest period of his life. Billy, confused, pointed out that Marco had been the prisoner. Surely survival hadn't depended on a few soccer matches. Marco shook his head. The matches had been everything. They'd given him purpose and dignity when he'd had neither. They'd reminded him he was more than a defeated soldier. He was an Italian, a footballer, a human being worthy of respect. The two men embraced. Billy promised to return someday with his own family. Marco promised the same if he ever got to America again. Both meant it, though neither knew if they'd be able to keep such promises. But the promises themselves mattered more than their fulfillment. They represented a bridge built through sport across a chasm carved by war. Other former prisoners returned to Texas in later years. Some came as tourists. Some came to marry American women they'd met through correspondence after the war. Some came simply because they'd been treated with unexpected kindness when they'd expected only cruelty. And they wanted to say thank you in person. Hereford never forgot the summer of 1944 when Italian prisoners transformed a dusty POW camp into an unlikely center for the beautiful game. Stories circulated for decades. Photographs yellowed but remained treasured. The old-timers who'd been. That first match told their grandchildren about the day. They learned that enemies could become something else if you gave them a soccer ball and a chance to be human. By the 1970s, soccer had grown into a major American sport, no longer foreign or exotic. Millions of kids played in youth leagues across the country. When people asked how soccer took root in places like West Texas, the answers usually focused on immigration and globalization. But in Hereford, they told a different story. They talked about Italian prisoners and American high school boys, and an afternoon in 1944, when sport proved more powerful than enmity. Marco died in 1989, an old man surrounded by family in Genoa. Among his possessions was a wooden box containing 17 addresses written on scraps of paper. American families who'd invited him back to Texas 45 years earlier. He'd kept every one. Some he'd visited. Some he'd written to. Some had faded into memory. But he'd kept them all because they represented the moment. He'd understood that war couldn't fully destroy human connection. Billy Crawford attended the funeral, making the long trip from Texas to Italy. He was old himself now, a retired teacher and coach. He stood at Marco's graveside and remembered that first match, the one they'd lost 6-1, but gained something more valuable than victory. He remembered learning that the enemy wasn't some abstract evil, but individual human beings. Some good, some bad. most somewhere in between. The cemetery overlooked Genoa's harbor. Billy stood there after everyone else had left, watching the Mediterranean shimmer in the afternoon light. He thought about how soccer had given him a lens for understanding the world that was more nuanced than war's simple binaries. Enemy or ally, good or evil, winner or loser. Sport taught you that life was more complex, that you could compete fiercely and still respect your opponent, that loss could teach more than victory, that the game mattered less than how you played it. He flew home to Texas the next day. At the Hereford airport, his granddaughter picked him up. She was 12 and played on a competitive soccer team. On the drive home, she chattered about her upcoming tournament. Billy listened, smiling. She had no idea that the sport she loved had arrived in her town through such an unlikely path. Prisoners and guards, enemies and neighbors, barbed wire and goalposts. Maybe someday he'd tell her the full story. About Marco and the other Italian prisoners. About learning a foreign game from men who'd fought against his country. About discovering that sport could build bridges faster than peace treaties. About the summer when soccer united Italian POWs and American towns in West Texas. But for now, he just listened to his granddaughter talk about her team's strategy for the next match. She described passing patterns and defensive positioning with an sophistication that would have impressed Marco. The beautiful game had taken root in American soil. It had grown and flourished. And in small towns like Hereford, those who knew the history understood that it had all started with a few Italian prisoners, a dusty field, and the universal human need for dignity, purpose, and connection. Even in the middle of a war, the field in Hereford is farmland now. Wheat grows where goalposts once stood. But on certain summer evenings, when the light slants golden across the plains, you can almost hear the echo of cheers, the thump of leather against leather, the sound of men from opposite sides of a war discovering they had more in common than they'd imagined. All because somebody kicked a ball.